Today, we're reading from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, Volume 1, which was originally called Lifetime in Preparation. And we're still on the foreword that was written by Dr. Harvey Cox, who's the head of the Divinity School at Harvard University in America. We were just finishing up last week, and we came to a very interesting sentence. Harvey Cox had come here to Vrindavan, and he was asked by the sadhus here to give a lecture. And because he was a Christian, he spoke about Jesus Christ and how Jesus Christ helped him in his life and how Jesus Christ has helped the world. And he said, they listened attentively and gratefully. Their only complaint, as I recall, was that I had not spoken long enough. Indians, unlike Americans, seem in no hurry to rush off to something else if there is a serious spiritual discussion to be followed. So he marked that about the Indian audience, because in America, Prabhupada he was always imitating, no time, no time. If you try to stop and talk to someone about spiritual life, sorry, I have no time. But just the opposite was here in India, and specifically here in Vrindavan. Any spiritual discussion, even if it was about Jesus Christ, they were interested to hear. They just wanted him to talk more. Given the fact that I was so well received in Srila Prabhupada's own land, I am sorry that he and his students still often find it so difficult to be heard or to be taken seriously here in America. So, because the culture of India, the Vedic culture, was brought by Srila Prabhupada to America, it was very foreign to Americans. And therefore, it took quite some time, now it's been more than 50 years, before this culture was considered even to be a religion. Cult comes from culture, but cult means something derogatory. It means it has no roots. It's something that's fabricated. So now, after more than 50 years of great endeavor by Srila Prabhupada, by the followers of Srila Prabhupada, and specifically by our Ministry of Communication that's worldwide, the Krishna Consciousness Society is being accepted as a bona fide religious system that's based on the Vedic texts. So Harvey Cox was saying that he was sorry that it could not be accepted at the time that he wrote this, which was more than 40 years ago. I am grateful for this book for two additional reasons that its writer could not have known. First, the author uses, among other methods, the growingly important method we in the West call oral history. Now, as a professor of divinity in such an elevated university as Harvard, when you write a book, specifically a biography, you have two sources, the primary sources and the secondary sources. Primary sources is what's being spoken about here, the oral history. Oral history means people who were there right at that time, and it was very recently, so it's very clear in their memories what happened. Plus their documents, their newspaper articles, their different lectures given about that subject. So you collect all these things together, and that's the primary source. Now, secondary source is, let's say you want to write about something that happened thousands of years ago. Well, you can't interview people. You have to go by things that other people might have said, or from a long time ago, what the memories are, or going to that place and trying to dig up the history. So these are secondary. It's not things that you can really depend upon. So Harvey Cox was appreciating that so quickly, right after Srila Prabhupada disappeared, this biography was written while those who were with Prabhupada could still give their memories, their oral histories. He incorporates the fruits of many interviews with the people who knew Srila Prabhupada or who encountered him, who contribute some little bit of information, however tiny or fleeting, to make up the whole picture. So when Satsvarup Maharaj was writing this, because we were in contact with all of the interviewers at that time, not only did he take interviews, but he also tried to understand the atmosphere of each place where Prabhupada was performing his pastimes. He would study the climate, he would study the geography, so that he could paint a picture of what Srila Prabhupada was presenting to that particular society. For instance, the pictures of Vrindavan. So in those days, Vrindavan was very, very different. If you look at the videos, we still had Nilgai and tigers and camels roaming, and it was just a whole different place as what you see now. So he would send people to find out about the different places so that he could add details of the geography and of the atmosphere where all these pastimes took place. It was a huge amount of work on many dimensions. In a few years, all these people will have passed on. So that's what's happening now. That's why we encourage all of the disciples of Srila Prabhupada to write their memories of Prabhupada, no matter how insignificant it might seem. It paints a picture of how Prabhupada touched the lives of so many thousands of people. And many of these people have now passed on. Those sources will be lost, at least in our mortal ears, forever. It is extremely important that the writer used this method and used it so very skillfully. I hope others will use it as effectively. Also, perhaps without fully intending to, the author is giving us a portrait of an age, the apex and nadir of the passing epoch of which might be called Western dominance. Now, of course, this is a scholar speaking. This is not ordinary English, so I'll just translate it into English so that we can understand. He's saying an age, the apex and nadir of a passing epoch. So apex means the top, and nadir means the bottom. And epoch means an age. So he's saying that this particular age is of Western dominance. Now, what is that Western dominance? He goes on to explain that. He shows us the devastation wreaked by cultural imperialism and demonstrates how stubbornly its destructive residues remain in the mental habits and even in the eating patterns of a previously colonized people long after the actual political rule of the outsider has been thrown off. So now he's speaking about India, because India had been colonized, not just by the British. Before that, it was under the Muslim subjugation for hundreds of years. This began 800 years ago, when the foreigners used to come and ravage the country, and they tried their best to destroy the Vedic culture here. But more than anyone, the British tried to do that, because they did everything possible to undermine Vedic culture, to convince people, to actually brainwash people here in India that their culture was inferior. And this went on for 200, 300 years. This was taught in the schools. It was, the government enacted this, that your culture should be rejected. You should take the Western dominating culture. That's the cultural imperialism, Western culture. Now things are changing. And that's because Prabhupada, he used to quote that the sun never sets on the British Empire, because the English people had so many colonies around the world that their entire empire, wherever the sun was, there was a colony. In Africa, in Asia, in South America, Canada, England itself. But it became weakened. It became weakened from the Second World War. And that was when India was able to get its chance to get its independence. Because India, the leaders in India were smart enough to understand that, because this is how the false famine happened here. Because the Prime Minister in England, he decided to starve all the people here in England, take all of their food, everything out of India to use for the war, and only those people who would join the army would be fed. And that forced all of the men to join the army here, the English army. But this is all, it's politics, but this is how the Vedic culture was resurrected in India. And this is what Harvey Cox is speaking about. Because when the UK became weakened, then the Indians were able to overcome being a colony anymore. And finally, by the end of the war, 1945, England was so weak that the Indians could take advantage of it, and by 1947, they got their independence, right? So this was the end of the cultural imperialism and Western domination here in India. But the mindset was still there. And that's why Harvey Cox said that even in the eating patterns, because we know by Vedic culture, Ayurvedically, you sit with your legs crossed, you eat with your hands. Everything is Vedically and Ayurvedically understood that that's the best way to eat. But the British came with their knives and forks and spoons, and they retaught the culture here in India. So people actually believed that this was a civilized way to live. So that had to be untaught. Just like when Prabhupada was going to America, one of his godbrothers taught him how to eat with a knife and a fork. You hold the food, you cut with the knife, you can never touch the food with your hands. You're considered a complete animal if you use your hands to eat in the West. My parents would look at us and say, what have they taught you? Because we're eating here, we eat off of leaves. They thought that we had become animals again, because that was Western culture. So Harvey Cox is lamenting that even after India wasn't a colony anymore, the mindset was still there. And Prabhupada broke that. When his godbrother tried to teach him how to eat with a knife and fork, he said, no, I am going to teach them. I don't want to learn from them. So he rejected that. And he taught us how to eat with our hands, how to sit on the floor, everything simple, according to Vedic culture. Especially since this volume covers that period of Srila Prabhupada's life before he came to America, it is vital to see that he was also instrumental in leading a revival of traditional Indian spiritual and cultural values in India itself before he came to our shores. So Prabhupada once gave an example. He said an elephant is valuable whether it's alive or it's dead. So practically the Vedic culture had died during the subjugation, the Western subjugation. It was completely pushed down. So that's like a dead elephant. An elephant, when it's alive, it's very powerful, can do so much work. But even a dead elephant, you can use its tusks, you can use its skin. It has 100 liters of water in its stomach at all times. There's so many valuable things. So this Veda culture, although it had somewhat died, Prabhupada revitalized that. And he used another example that you have a tree, and if you want to cut down the tree, you use an axe. Now, what is an axe? An axe is a piece of wood, but it has a foreign element. It has that metal on the edge, right? So you take from the tree, the wood, you add a foreign element, and then you can cut down the tree. So this was Prabhupada's philosophy. He took the Vedic culture, he brought it to the West, and then within just 5 years, he had made enough disciples. He brought that foreign element back to India, and he was able to reestablish that Vedic culture again. Just like the people come here to our temple, they're so impressed. And as foreigners, we feel like they're looking at us like we're in a zoo. You know? They just come and because they can't believe it, that Westerners, they're wearing sari and dhoti, they have tilak, everything Vedic, everything that they're supposed to be doing. And when they see the Westerners do it, then they become proud of their culture and they start to do it also. So this was Prabhupada's, he was such an excellent psychologist. He used that Western element to reestablish the Vedic culture here in India. Phase 1 for Prabhupada was to carry out his spiritual master's instructions. That was to go to the West and preach Krishna consciousness. After he did that, he started phase 2. Phase 2 was to bring Krishna consciousness back to India. Because before he left, we will read in this volume, Lifetime in Preparation, he had no success. No one was interested. He would say to the wealthy men, "You have 5 sons. Give me 1 son, and I will train him to be a Brahmin." And the man would say, "Why do I want him to be a Brahmin? They're just beggars." "No, I want him to make money." He couldn't get a single follower. When he left India, he had only 1 disciple. That was Acharya Prabhakar. He was one of the students at Jhansi, a medical student, but he also knew Sanskrit. Only 1 disciple Prabhupada was able to make in all the years that he had struggled here preaching. But when he went to the West, he was able to make more than 4,000 disciples. And then his plan in phase 2 was to bring those disciples back to India and show that this culture is the highest culture, and even the Westerners are now accepting it. Because before, the Westerners were pushing their culture. Now the Westerners are accepting the Vedic culture. Okay. It is vital to see that he was also instrumental in leading a revival of traditional Indian spiritual and cultural values in India itself before he came to our shores. Since that self-same phenomenon is now underway, wherever the long arm of European dominance once reached, the book can also be read as an integral part of the growing literature of Third World cultural renaissance. Now, this is what's going on right now here in India. Third World means those countries who are not fully developed industrially. Now, unfortunately, India is still considered in that category. It's coming up as one of the leaders now, but it's still considered third world according to the Western countries. Third world cultural renaissance. So now we're seeing that there is a rebirth, that they're taking back the temples now. They're reestablishing the Vedic cultures. They're stopping cow slaughter. Cow slaughter was begun in the 1970s here. There were huge riots because cow slaughter was always against the law until in about I forget exactly, it was the end of the 1960s. There were huge riots when the Prime Minister then allowed cow slaughter, first in Tamil Nadu, then in West Bengal, and all of the saints and sages went on huge riots here because cow slaughter was allowed. So even the Indian government at that time was trying to imitate the West by allowing cow slaughter. Now that cow slaughter is being gotten rid of because of the renaissance of the third world cultural renaissance. And that's going on in other countries now as well. But India is the leader for reestablishing their culture now. Obviously, this volume can be appreciated in many ways. It can also be read, I should say, as a very fascinating story of a very fascinating man. In any case, however the present reader wishes to approach it, I am glad now to terminate this foreword and allow him or her to get on with the joy of reading. This is why also Prabhupada recommends that everyone should read Krishna book. Even if you don't know who Krishna is, the stories are so interesting that you'll appreciate Krishna. So even if one does not understand what Prabhupada was able to accomplish, the story of his life and his accomplishments are so interesting that you will gradually learn to appreciate Prabhupada's great contribution to the world just by reading this book. So now we're going on to what's called the preface. The preface was written by the author of the book, Satsvarup Das Goswami. Satsvarup Das Goswami, when Srila Prabhupada, when he first went to America, he was the guest of one Mayavadi yogi guru named Dr. Mishra in New York City. And he was dependent upon Dr. Mishra. Prabhupada wanted to break that dependence. He was giving classes in one of his yoga studios, but some of his students told him they didn't call him Prabhupada, then they called him Swamiji. Why don't you come to where all the youth live and you can give your classes there? So Prabhupada broke away from Dr. Mishra and he went to the most degraded part of New York City called the Bowery, where all of the drunkards live and all of the homeless people live. For Prabhupada, it didn't matter. He was ready to preach to everyone. But the hippies also lived there. So Prabhupada lived in what was called the Bowery on a 4th floor apartment. And he held his classes there. But the person who he was sharing the apartment with was taking LSD, a very strong psychopathic drug. And one day he went mad and tried to attack Srila Prabhupada. And Prabhupada had to flee the apartment. He had nowhere to go. So he went to some of his students' houses who became Mukunda Das. And they found him a small shop at 26 2nd Avenue. And Prabhupada in July of 1966 moved into that apartment, an apartment and a storefront. A storefront is like what we have here. You know, when you just cross the street, you see these stores. It means it's right on the roadside. That's what a storefront is. And it has a big glass window and a door to go in. Here, most of the stores are open, but we have our storefronts in the front now, like our international bookshop. That's a storefront. Big display window with a door to enter. So that's the type of store that Prabhupada made his temple in. So Satsvarup Maharaj saw on the window of that storefront an advertisement that he just wrote on a piece of paper, Bhagavad-Gita classes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 7 to 8:30, something like that. And Satsvarup, who was Stephen at the time, he had just dropped out of the Navy, the U.S. Navy. His family, they were Catholics, and they lived in another part of New York City called Staten Island. It's a little island that's part of New York. And he just was not interested in mainstream American life. So he came to live in New York where all the hippies lived. And he saw that sign and he started going to the classes. And because he was an educated young man, he offered to type Prabhupada's manuscripts, because Prabhupada used to just type with one finger, like this. And in America, they type 80 words a minute. They learn how to type without looking. So he typed all of Prabhupada's stacks and stacks of manuscripts. And on the night of the first initiation, January 1966, in August, Stephen felt that he wasn't ready for initiation. He just spent the night typing for Swamiji. He thought, if I'm just doing service, that's good enough. The next day, Prabhupada asked him, why didn't you come for initiation? He said, well, I didn't feel I was ready. And Prabhupada said, that's all right. 15 days from now, on Radharani's birthday, we're having another initiation. So on that second initiation, he and 3 other devotees, Kirtanananda, Brahmananda, and Achyutananda, and Satsvarup, that was Stephen, Satsvarup Das Goswami, they all got initiated by Radharani's mercy on Radhastami. So he was with Srila Prabhupada from the very first days that he was there at 26 Second Avenue. He saw everything of ISKCON, and he's still active. Although he's retired, emeritus GBC, he no longer accepts disciples. He was one of the 11 gurus that Prabhupada had assigned after he left. He was in charge of our library party, distributing books all over the world in the libraries. He was in charge of our Gurukula in Dallas, Texas. He was in charge of our ISKCON press, which was the printing press that printed before BBT was established in 1972. He has such a record of wonderful service that he had done for Srila Prabhupada and is still doing. He's still writing every day. He's still communicating with his disciples. But he lives a secluded life now, way in the forests near Canada in New York. He doesn't travel anymore. He used to come here regularly. So this is the preface written by Satsvarup Das Goswami. After the disappearance of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada from this mortal world on November 14, 1977, many of his disciples saw a need for an authorized biography of Srila Prabhupada. Now, this word authorized, Prabhupada uses it in every single lecture. Authorized means it's coming from a higher authority, from the authorities. In the case of any great personality, you can find authorized biographies and unauthorized biographies. And it's these unauthorized biographies that destroy the character of a genuine saintly person. So it was very important that this biography be authorized. And that means it had to come from those primary sources of history. And it had to be done quickly while we were all still alive who were with Prabhupada. The responsibility of commissioning such a work rested with the governing body commission of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. At their annual meeting in 1978, that was the first meeting after Srila Prabhupada left this world, just 4 months after he left, the GBC resolved that a biography of Srila Prabhupada should be written and that I would be the author. Satsvarup Maharaj was also the editor of the Back to Godhead magazine up until 1991. And then he turned it over to the assistant editor, who was Jayadvaita Swami. So his literary contribution was very great, even before Srila Prabhupada left this world and even before he wrote this biography. According to the Vaishnava tradition, if one aspires to write transcendental literature, he must first take permission from his spiritual master and Krishna. A good example of this is Krishna Das Kaviraj Goswami, the author of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's authorized biography, Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. Now, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, he came after Lord Chaitanya's appearance. He never met Lord Chaitanya. He was living in Katwa, which is in the district of Burdwan. Katwa is where Lord Chaitanya took sannyas, where he had his head shaven. He was from that little place near there. And he was a great devotee of Lord Chaitanya. And one day, one of Nityananda Prabhu's associates came to visit his house, Miniketan Ramdas. Now, Krishnadas Kaviraj had a brother, and they worshipped Radha and Krishna in their home. And the pujari, whose name was Gunarnava Mishra, he also had high respect and worship of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but he had no respect for Nityananda Prabhu. And therefore, when he saw the associate of Nityananda Prabhu, Miniketan Ramdas, he did not offer him any respect, because he didn't respect Nityananda Prabhu. This is compared to when Balaram came to Naimisharanya, and Ramaharshana did not offer him proper respect. And we know what Balaram did to him. So this pujari, because he did not respect Nityananda Prabhu, and the brother of Krishnadas Kaviraj also did not respect Nityananda Prabhu, immediately Krishnadas Kaviraj wanted to give up their association. That night in dream, Nityananda Prabhu came to Krishnadas Kaviraj and ordered him to leave immediately for Vrindavan. That night he left and came to Vrindavan, met the 6 Goswamis, some of them, and he was ordered at that time by the devotees of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to please write a biography about Lord Chaitanya. Now, biographies had already been written by Lochan Das Thakur, by Vrindavan Das Thakur, but no one had yet written about the latter pastimes of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So Vrindavan Das Thakur, Krishnadas Kaviraj, he heard from Raghunath Das Goswami and others who had associated with Lord Chaitanya about the latter pastimes. He very briefly covered the early pastimes, the Adi Lila, and then in great detail went into the Madhya Lila and the Antya Lila of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in his biography. As Krishnadas Kaviraj has explained, in Vrindavan there were also many other great devotees, all of whom desired to hear the last pastimes of Lord Chaitanya. By their mercy, all of these devotees ordered me to write of the last pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Because of their order only, although I am shameless, I have attempted to write this Chaitanya Charitamrita. Having received the order of the Vaishnavas, but being anxious within my heart, I went back to the temple of Madan Mohan in Vrindavan to ask his permission. So we have here the sloka number 72. This is what Krishnadas Kaviraj is saying here. So we can sing this sloka together. More agya karila shabe koruna kariya. Thansa bara bole liki nirlaja haiya. More agya karila sabe karuna kariya. Thansa bara bole liki nirlaja haiya. More agya karila sabe karuna kariya. Thansa bara bole liki nirlaja haiya. More unto me, Agya, order, Karila, gave, Sabe, all, Karuna, merciful, Koriya, doing so, Tan Sabare, of all of them, Bole, by the order, Liki, I write, Nirlaja, without shame, Haya, becoming. Translation. By their mercy, all these devotees ordered me to write of the last pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Because of their order only, although I am shameless, I have attempted to write this Chaitanya Charitamrita. Purport. To write about the transcendental pastimes of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is not an ordinary endeavor. Unless one is empowered by the higher authorities or advanced devotees, one cannot write transcendental literature, for all such literature must be above suspicion, or in other words, it must have none of the defects of conditioned souls, namely mistakes, illusions, cheating, and imperfect sense perceptions. The words of Krishna and of the disciplic succession that carries the orders of Krishna are actually authoritative. To be empowered to write transcendental literature is a privilege in which a writer can take great pride. As a humble Vaishnava, Krishnadas Kaviraj, being thus empowered, felt very much ashamed that it was he who was to narrate the pastimes of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, because it's a great responsibility to be able to narrate the pastimes of the Supreme Lord or of the Lord's pure devotees. And just as Krishnadas Kaviraj, he calls himself shameless, nirlaja. What is my qualification to speak about the pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu? So in that same humility, Satsvarup Maharaj was feeling himself completely unqualified, although he had been ordered to do so by the highest authority in ISKCON, which was the governing body commission, and the devotees were anxious to read about the life of Srila Prabhupada and his accomplishments. So you have two factors here. The author considering himself unqualified, but because of the order and the desire of the devotees, he must do it. And that's what compels a person and inspires a person to write. And he must do it very carefully so that there are none of the four defects within his writing. It's very difficult and a very great responsibility. So this is why Satsvarup Maharaj, he referred to the exact same feelings that Krishnadas Kaviraj was experiencing when he was ordered and requested by the devotees here in Vrindavan who didn't get to see the pastimes of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, his later pastimes. They asked Krishnadas Kaviraj to compile those pastimes, although he also didn't get to see the pastimes. So he had to do everything by oral history. And therefore, it's very similar comparison. Satsvarup Maharaj trying to write about Srila Prabhupada, and Krishnadas Kaviraj attempting to write about Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So to say that the Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita is an authorized biography does not mean that it is a flattering portrait commissioned by an official body, but that it is an authorized literature presented by one who is serving the order of Krishna and Guru through the disciplic succession. As such, Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita is not written from the mundane or speculative viewpoint, nor can ordinary biographers comprehend the significance and meaning of the life of a pure devotee of God. Now this is why Satsvarup Maharaj, he's just one person. And he was Srila Prabhupada's personal servant. After Shrutakirti left Srila Prabhupada in 1973, after serving him for 2 years and traveling around the world, he said 5 times with Prabhupada, he then left to be with his family. And Prabhupada assigned or requested Sasrup Maharaj to become his personal servant. He only traveled with Prabhupada for 7 months. And the rest of that time, he was engaged in preaching work and establishing temples and in distributing books. So we only got to see a fragment of Srila Prabhupada's 11 years with the devotees in ISKCON. 7 months. And whatever short association he had with Prabhupada in New York and when Prabhupada would visit his temples. So he had to depend very heavily on the descriptions given by the other devotees and other people who were with Prabhupada at other times. And that was collected. So, were such persons to objectively study the life of Srila Prabhupada, the esoteric meanings would evade them. Now, how Prabhupada touched the lives of his disciples and those who met him could only be described by those people. And that's why it all had to be captured very quickly. Were they to charitably try to praise Srila Prabhupada, they would not know how. But because Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita is authorized through the transcendental process, it can transparently present the careful reader with the true picture of Srila Prabhupada. Just as we saw in the life of the Pandavas and Kunti Devi, and many other devotees that are described in Srimad Bhagavatam, being a pure devotee is not always easy. There are a lot of difficulties. And Krishna gives those difficulties to test his devotee. And the exact same thing happened with Srila Prabhupada. In his endeavors to carry out the order of his spiritual master, he faced many difficulties. And that's what's being presented here. Not just a flowery description of some great yogi who came to America and did this and that and the other thing. No. All of the difficulties that Prabhupada experienced are also going to be described in this biography. Another important aspect of the authenticity of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita is the vast amount of carefully researched information that I am able to focus into each volume. The leading devotees of the Krishna consciousness movement, in addition to giving me permission to render this work, have also invited the world community of ISKCON devotees to help me in gathering detailed information about the life and person of Srila Prabhupada. So we described last week that all these 7 volumes were written within 4 years. And it was like a marathon. Many devotees were part of the team. They were sent all over the world to interview, to gain the history of how Prabhupada established his 108 temples, how he made the disciples, all the different television programs and newspaper articles had to be collected. This was primary sources for making this biography. And that was all done within a matter of only 4 years. Although Prabhupada was a lifetime of 81 years. So a lot of work, and a lot of devotees worked on this together. The Bhaktivedanta Book Trust, Prabhupada's publishing house, has given me his collection of letters, totaling over 7,000. Now, there are many more. There were only 7,000 at that time. There are many more than that now. And scores of Prabhupada's disciples have granted interviews and submitted diaries and memoirs of their association with Srila Prabhupada. Aside from his disciples, we have interviewed many persons in various walks of life who met Srila Prabhupada over the years. For instance, there was one man who used to sit on a bench in a park, and Prabhupada used to talk to this man. And he once told the man, he said, "There are many temples, there are many books, but I'm only separated by time from those things." So he was opening up his heart to this man who was just sitting on a park bench with him. And many years later, this man met the devotees and remembered Srila Prabhupada and gave that memory that came into this book. So there were many, many people other than the disciples and the devotees and people here in India who knew Prabhupada, people who had no direct contact with Prabhupada other than just by chance they met him. So that was also collected. The result is that we have a rich composite view of Srila Prabhupada, drawn from many persons who knew him in many different situations and stages of his life. The acknowledgments section in this book lists the persons who are cooperating to bring about Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita. Despite the authorized nature of this book and despite the support of my many well-wishers, I must confess that in attempting to describe the glories of our spiritual master, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, I am like a small bird trying to empty the ocean by carrying drops of water to the land. The picture I have given of Srila Prabhupada is only a glimpse into his unlimited mercy, and that glimpse has only been possible by the grace of Guru and Krishna, Satsrup Das Goswami. That's why even those of us who gave our memoirs, now how much could Satsrup Maharaj put into the biography? He was concentrating on Srila Prabhupada and painting a picture so that we could all understand Prabhupada's personality and accomplishments. But there was so much more that he couldn't give. And therefore, over these last 47 years, devotees have written their own books that describe their personal relationships with Prabhupada and how Prabhupada encouraged them, inspired them, and molded them into what they were and are today. So those books can also be studied. You get a lot of inspiration from reading the books written also by the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. So if there are any questions, we have 5 minutes. Otherwise, we can go on to the acknowledgments. Okay, no questions? Then we'll just read quickly the acknowledgments. This is just the list of those who were the most prominent devotees who helped Satsrup Maharaj collect all the information he needed to write the Prabhupada Lilamrita. The main assistants for this volume were Mandaleshwar Das, editor, and Shesha Das, research coordinator. Shesha Das, is he still in our VEB? Not active. He also takes part here, or had taken part for many years, as part of our executive board in Vrindavan, Shesha Das. And he wrote a beautiful book, a photographic essay of Srila Prabhupada called Acharya. You can see it in the Matchless Gift Shop. Chief interviewers in India were Baladev Vidyabhushan Das, that's a disciple of Satsrup Maharaj, and Kundali Das, he's a disciple of Prabhupada. Other interviewers, they were sent here because, of course, in the 1970s when all of this was done, communication, there were no such things as, we didn't use computers, no one had a computer, they didn't exist yet. No one had cell phones. Everything was done just by handwritten letters. So the people had to come here themselves and interview us. And then those interviews had to be transcribed. They were all taken back to America for transcription. So these two personalities, Baladev, Vidyabhushan, and Kundali, they came here to India and interviewed us. Other interviewers were Santosh Das, Bhakti Charu Swami, Sarvabhavana Das, Krishna Gopal Das, Yadubar Das, Vishaka Devi Dasi, Patita Pavana Das, Narada Rishi Das, and Tejas Das. Jayadvaita Swami gave a final polishing to the manuscript. Acharya Devi Dasi was the typist. Radha Ballabha Das and Rajendranath Das, Bhaktivedanta Book Trust production managers, supervised the book's production. So this was not a one-man show. He had a lot of backup people helping him within the society. The typist in the BBT office, Mamata Devi Dasi and Drishtaketu Das, supplied transcripts of Srila Prabhupada's recorded lectures and conversations. Now, we have to also remember that the BBT was set up to print Srila Prabhupada's books. So after Srila Prabhupada left, what were they going to print? Prabhupada wasn't giving any more books to us. So there was a gap of time, also until 1981, that 4 years, till the first chapter of 10th Canto, chapter 13, came out. So these 4 years were used to print this book and then to start the translation of the 10th Canto that was to be done by the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. So this 4 years was very formative in what the BBT was going to be doing now that Srila Prabhupada had disappeared, because there weren't going to be any more books to publish. So this was the first to be published, the book about Prabhupada. And then from that time onwards, then the Srimad Bhagavatam was continued. And also the recorded lectures and conversations, they all had to be typed out so Satsvarup Maharaj could read them all. So there were some devotees doing that typing. The BBT press staff of Sureshwar, Gopi Puranadana Das, Sri Kanta, Singheshwar Das, Kirtan Ras Das, Brihad Mridanga Das, Krishna Sneha, Balai Devi Dasi, Kshama Devi Dasi, Rukmini Devi Dasi, and others did the designing, composing, proofreading, indexing, and layout. Now, we didn't have computer programs in those days to do designing. I used to serve at the press. Everything had to be done. We had to cut out the paper and paste it. And for instance, any sloka, we'd have to cut out the Sanskrit, then cut out the English, then type everything. Everything was done by hand in those days. All the photography, we had a dark room. We had to go into the dark room, and we had to develop the film ourselves and then check everything. It was all old-fashioned style in those days. So all that had to be done. That's why there's so many people involved here, because so much work had to be done by all the devotees to get this book printed. Nityatripta Devi, Vidyananda Das, Nityatripta Devi Dasi, Ekanath Das, and Param Rupa. They were setting up the archives at that time. The archives were originally in San Diego, and then they moved to a place in North Carolina, in Sandy Ridge, North Carolina. They have big vaults where they're keeping all of Prabhupada's original things, his writings, and all of the things that we had from Prabhupada's house that were literary, we sent there, because they're being preserved so that these things will last for the next 10,000 years. Because paper, acid in paper, it disintegrates. So they have special vaults to keep all the paper and photographs so that they won't disintegrate. So that was all set up then also. They are compiling in archives of Srila Prabhupada readily supplied materials needed for this volume. Illustrators were Parikshit Das, Bharadraj Das, Ram Das, Abhiram Das, Dhriti Devi Dasi, Dirga Devi Dasi, Jagat Karana Devi Dasi, and Yarurani Devi Dasi. Now this art department, they had been painting all the books for Prabhupada, all the paintings for Prabhupada's books. And again, suddenly they had no more books to paint for. So they painted for this book. You'll see all these pictures and many other pictures within. So everything now was being shifted to getting these books printed about Prabhupada. I would also like to thank Srila Rameshwar Swami and Srila Jayapataka Swami for their help in various ways. So Rameshwar was in charge of the BBT in America, and Jayapataka Swami, I'm sure, gave his support in many ways from here in India. Okay, thank you very much. Hare Krishna.